"You're just a housewife," Dean said, shaking his head as I stirred the pot. I smiled, wiped my hands, and asked if he wanted garlic bread. A year later, he applied for a job at the company I secretly owned. My name is Ilara Monroe, and for nearly 4 decades, I've been the woman behind the curtain, the one who made sure everyone else's life ran smoothly. I cooked, I cleaned, I raised 2 children. I smiled at the right moments. I kept the peace. And through it all, I believed that being needed was the same as being valued. Until that night. It was a Thursday. Ordinary, forgettable. I was in the kitchen making Dean's favorite, baked ziti with garlic bread. I remember the smell of the garlic butter melting in the pan, the way the sauce bubbled in the corner of the casserole dish, the way the kitchen light made everything feel warm. I wore an old apron Sienna gave me for Mother's Day a few years ago. Queen of the kitchen, it said. I used to think it was cute. Dean was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone, muttering something about a frustrating day at work. I wasn't really listening. I was used to this routine. The complaints, the sighs, the expectation that I would absorb the negativity without a ripple. Then, without even looking up, he said it. "You're just a housewife." No venom, no anger, just dismissal. A sentence tossed out like a gum wrapper. For a moment, the kitchen went quiet. Even the oven seemed to pause. I looked at him. Really looked. The man I had supported through every layoff, every business pivot, every ego-bruising failure. The man whose dry cleaning I picked up, whose kids I raised while he traveled, whose dinner I had just pulled out of the oven. Just a housewife. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I smiled. I took the pan of garlic bread out of the oven, placed it gently on the counter, and asked if he wanted 2 pieces or 3. That was the moment everything changed. Not on the outside, but inside me. Something cracked. Something opened. Because I knew something Dean didn't. I had started a business 6 months earlier. I hadn't told him. I hadn't told anyone, really. It was small, secret, mine. I worked on it in the early mornings after dinner whenever I could steal a few moments. I built it quietly, like a woman sewing armor beneath her gown. And as I stood there smiling, handing him a plate of food, I realized something else. He would never see it coming. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Before all of this, before the garlic bread, the silent smile, and the secret company, there was a time when I thought I had everything I needed. Dean and I met in college. He was charismatic, ambitious, the kind of man who could turn heads just by walking into a room. I was quieter, always the one behind the scenes, the organizer, the listener, the support. But when he looked at me, really looked at me, it felt like I was the center of his world, or at least that's what I believed. We got married at 24. It was a spring wedding, simple and sweet. My mother gave me her pearls. Dean's father gave him a firm handshake and a list of expectations. We honeymooned in a tiny cabin in Vermont, drank wine by a fire that never quite stayed lit, and talked about everything we would build together. A home, a family, a future. He said, "You and me, Ilara, no matter what." At first, he meant it. When I got pregnant with Sienna a year later, I was working in the marketing department of a boutique skincare company. I loved that job. I loved the brainstorming sessions, the color palettes, the feeling of being part of something that grew and changed. But we both agreed that someone should be home with the baby. And Dean's career was just getting off the ground. So I stepped away. Just for a few years, we said. Then Micah came. Then Dean started his construction company. Then we moved and moved again. And each time I thought, next year I'll go back. Next year I'll pick up where I left off. But years passed. My resume aged. The world kept moving forward, and I stayed in the kitchen, in the laundry room, at the PTA meetings, in the emergency room holding a feverish child's hand. And I didn't resent it. Not really. There were moments of deep contentment. Baking cookies with Sienna on rainy afternoons, watching Micah's soccer games with a thermos of hot cocoa, slow mornings with Dean when the kids slept in, and we sat on the porch drinking coffee. Back then, Dean still noticed me. He would bring me little gifts, a scarf, my favorite magazine, a new mug. He'd call from job sites just to say hi. And sometimes, on Saturday nights, he'd take me dancing, just like we used to in college. In those moments, I felt seen. But over time, those moments grew scarce. And like anything you stop tending to, the closeness began to wilt. He got busier, more distracted. The business demanded more of his time. I became the background noise to his ambitions. Still, I clung to the idea that this was love. This was marriage, a team. I thought, he works hard. I support him. That's what we do. And I was good at it. I ran our household with precision. Every holiday was thoughtfully planned, every appointment scheduled, every bill paid. I became the invisible engine that kept our family moving, and everyone depended on it, especially Dean. Even when I felt tired, unappreciated, or lonely, I told myself it was just a phase. That someday, when the kids were grown and things settled down, we'd go back to how it used to be. That Dean would see me again. Not just the meals or the clean clothes or the calendar reminders, but me. I even started a gratitude journal, thinking that if I could focus on the good, I could make the loneliness feel smaller. I wrote about the smell of fresh sheets, Micah's bear hugs, the way Dean still held the door open for me, even if he was already talking on the phone. I tried to make the pieces add up to enough. Corinne, my best friend since high school, used to ask me, "Don't you ever miss being a Laura? Not wife, not mom, just you?" I'd laugh and say, "She's still in here, she's just busy." But the truth is, I hadn't heard my own voice in years. Not the part of me that dreamed, that imagined, that created. I had buried that woman under layers of casseroles, laundry, and polite smiles. Still, I believed I was lucky. I had a roof over my head, a husband who didn't cheat or hit, kids who were kind and smart. And every time I doubted my worth, I'd look at my family and think, this is enough. This has to be enough. Because if it wasn't, what did that say about everything I had sacrificed? I didn't know it then, but the cracks had already started forming, quietly, slowly, invisibly. And soon those cracks would turn into a fault line. One careless sentence would split it wide open. But before that, before the fall, there was routine. There was comfort. There was the illusion that love and usefulness were the same thing, and that illusion was everything I had. It happened at the Baxters' anniversary party. Dean and I had been invited to celebrate their 35th wedding anniversary, a garden party with white lights, champagne flutes, and a live jazz band playing beneath a canopy of magnolias. Everyone was dressed up. I wore a navy dress I hadn't worn in years and even curled my hair. Dean said I looked nice as we got into the car, then went back to checking his phone. At the party, people mingled and toasted and swapped stories about kids and vacations. I moved through the crowd with ease, smiling, checking in on who needed what, helping the hostess find extra napkins when the breeze knocked over the dessert table. It was second nature, being useful. Later, while we were gathered around the bar, one of Dean's former colleagues, a woman named Renee who'd started her own interior design firm, asked what I'd been up to lately. It was such a simple question, but it caught me off guard. I hesitated for half a second, thinking, should I tell her about the marketing ideas I've been jotting down, the product line I've been dreaming of? Before I could speak, Dean chuckled. "She's the CEO of our household," he said, patting my shoulder like I was a good dog. "Keeps things running like clockwork. Don't let her near your QuickBooks, though. She still thinks PDFs are a mystery." The group laughed. Even Renee a bit uncomfortably. I laughed too. Of course I did. What else was I supposed to do? But something tightened inside my chest. It was the way he said it. Offhand, dismissive, like I was amusing but not to be taken seriously. Like my work, my routines, my life weren't really worth mentioning. I told myself not to overthink it, that Dean was just making conversation, that he didn't mean anything by it. But it didn't end there. Later, as the night wore on and the champagne loosened everyone's tongues, another couple asked Dean if he'd ever thought about expanding his business out of state. Dean laughed and said, "That would mean I'd have to train Alara to take over the home front, and I'm not sure she could handle the logistics." The words were playful, but something in me winced, not because of what he said, but because of how effortlessly it came. Like this was just the accepted truth. Alara can't handle logistics. Alara doesn't understand real work. Alara is only capable of managing grocery lists and holiday menus. I wanted to say something, I wanted to correct him, but I stayed silent. I stood there holding my empty glass and smiled. That night, as we drove home, Dean hummed along to the radio like nothing had happened. I watched the shadows on his face and the passing headlights and felt small, not angry, not even sad, just reduced. It wasn't the first time he had made a joke like that, but for some reason, that night lodged in my memory like a splinter. Maybe because it had happened in public. Maybe because for the first time I realized how other people might actually believe him. Back home, I changed into my pajamas and stood in front of the bathroom mirror. I looked at myself, the woman who had raised 2 kids, kept a household running, navigated family crises, budgeted, planned, mediated, managed. The woman who had once run campaigns and presentations and knew how to turn a brand from an idea into a story. But when had I last used those muscles? I wiped off my mascara and told myself to let it go. Dean had a stressful job. He needed to feel like the expert. And if making little jokes at my expense helped him feel in control, wasn't that just part of marriage? Still, that night I wrote something in my journal. Something I rarely did anymore. He used to see me as a partner. Now I think he sees me as a function. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Then I shut the book and put it back in the drawer. I didn't bring it up the next morning. I made coffee, ironed his shirt, packed his lunch, and waved as he drove off. But that sentence never left me. It was the first red flag, the first tear in the fabric. At the time, I didn't know where it would lead. I didn't know that a year from that moment, Dean would walk into a job interview and see my name at the top of the company letterhead. But I do remember thinking as I folded laundry later that afternoon, one day I will not be invisible. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't feel like silence. It feels like being talked over, like having someone respond to your thoughts with a nod that doesn't reach their eyes. It feels like making dinner for 25 years and realizing one day you no longer know what your husband's favorite meal is because he stopped saying thank you a long time ago. That's what my days began to feel like. At first, I told myself I was just tired. The kids were grown, Dean was busier than ever, and I had more free time than I was used to. But the stillness wasn't restful. It was heavy. It sat on my chest like a brick I couldn't name. Dean would come home later and later, walking in while I was mid-sentence on the phone with Sienna or folding towels. "What's for dinner?" was often the first thing he said. No greeting. No, "How was your day?" Not even eye contact. Just the assumption that dinner would be made and ready. I didn't mind making dinner. I liked feeding the people I loved. What I minded was how invisible it became. If I made his favorite, roasted lemon chicken with rosemary, he'd glance at it, eat in silence, and then disappear into the den to watch cable news. If I served leftovers, he'd mutter, "We had this yesterday," and push it around his plate. I started going to the library more often. Not to check out books, though I loved being around them. I just liked the quiet, the rows of possibility. There, no one interrupted me. No one rolled their eyes. I could think. One afternoon, I ran into Corinne while I was sipping coffee at a corner table. She hugged me and said, "You look tired." "I'm just busy," I said, though I wasn't. That was the truth. I wasn't busy. I was vanishing. She invited me to help her with a weekend pop-up market. She ran a line of artisan teas and needed someone to help with displays. For 2 days, I talked to strangers, made marketing suggestions, and handled payment processing. I remembered how good I used to be at this. I remembered how it felt to contribute something measurable, something seen. When I told Dean about it that Sunday night, he barely looked up from his phone. "You worked a booth?" he said, half smirking. "Hope you didn't scare off the customers?" I laughed weakly, like it was funny, and then went to bed early. I lay on my side, listening to him snore, and felt like I'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. It wasn't just the words. It was how little of me registered anymore. If I changed my hairstyle, He didn't notice. If I set the table differently or bought new curtains, he assumed they'd always been that way. If I tried to talk about something I was reading or a podcast I'd found interesting, he would grunt or change the subject. Once I tried to tell him I'd been thinking about going back to school, maybe taking a few online business courses. He blinked and said, "At your age?" like I'd told him I was auditioning for the circus. After that, I stopped mentioning new ideas. I started walking more, long loops around the neighborhood, not for fitness, but for space, mental space. I needed somewhere to think where no one could roll their eyes or make me feel foolish. I listened to podcasts about entrepreneurship, watched YouTube tutorials about product design, and began sketching out concepts for a brand I'd once imagined when I was fresh out of college. I kept it all to myself, because slowly, quietly, I began to realize that nothing I said would matter to Dean unless it reinforced the version of me he'd already accepted. Ilara, the housewife. Ilara, the background. Ilara, the quiet echo in his life. I didn't yell, I didn't fight, I didn't storm out. I simply began pulling parts of myself inward, like folding up paper birds no one would ever see. I smiled when necessary, responded when spoken to, and got very good at pretending nothing was wrong. But there's a cost to invisibility, and eventually, I stopped feeling sad about being ignored and started feeling determined. Because if Dean couldn't see me, then maybe that gave me the freedom to become someone he wouldn't recognize at all. And maybe that was the only way I'd ever be free. It was the evening of Dean's annual company banquet, a formal affair he insisted I attend every year, though he never seemed particularly pleased when I did. I spent hours getting ready, not out of vanity, but because I hadn't been out in so long. I wanted to feel beautiful, relevant, like I still existed outside the walls of our home. I wore a deep green satin dress Corinne had helped me pick out during a rare afternoon shopping trip. She said it made my eyes look fierce. I curled my hair, wore the pearl earrings Dean had given me when Micah was born, and took a long breath before stepping into the living room. Dean barely looked up from his watch. "We're already late," he said, grabbing his blazer off the hook. "You didn't have anything simpler?" I froze. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's not a red carpet," he said, giving a half smile as if that softened the blow. "You're going to make everyone else's wives feel underdressed." I smoothed my dress silently. The compliments I'd been waiting for never came. Not "you look nice," not "I'm glad you're coming," not even a glance long enough to register pride. Just criticism, just irritation, just the subtle suggestion that I was once again too much. At the banquet, I clung to my glass of water like a lifeline. The venue was lovely. High ceilings, golden candlelight, waitstaff in black tuxedos. But I felt like a ghost in a borrowed dress. Dean introduced me around, mostly to male colleagues, who nodded politely and asked the usual small talk questions. "So, what do you do?" Still keeping Dean in line? I smiled, gave polite answers, said I was enjoying my time at home. Every word felt like swallowing gravel. Then came the moment. Dean had been called up to speak, to deliver a short toast recognizing his team's success that year. He took the microphone with ease, cracking a few practice jokes that got the usual chuckles. Then he turned toward the guests, gesturing to our table. "And of course," he said, "a big thanks to my wife, Ilara, who's kept our laundry folded and the fridge stocked since 1991. The room burst into light laughter. Dean smirked, pleased with himself. He had delivered the line like it was a badge of honor, like I should be grateful just to be acknowledged. But I wasn't laughing. I sat there, cheeks burning, gripping my napkin under the table like a lifeline. I heard one of the younger wives whisper, "Is she serious? That's how he introduced her?" Another woman across the table smiled apologetically, the way you do when you witness something that makes you feel sorry for someone, but also glad it wasn't you. I smiled through it. I always did. Dean sat down beside me, leaning in to ask, "That wasn't too much, was it?" I shook my head and said nothing. But something inside me ruptured. Not from the joke itself. No. It was the casual way he'd delivered it, the comfort he felt in using me as a prop, as a punchline, The fact that, in a room full of powerful people, my value had been reduced to what I stocked in our refrigerator, like I was an appliance that deserved a round of applause. When we got home, he was in good spirits, joking about the compliments he received and asking if I had fun. I told him I had a headache and went straight to bed. Lying there in the dark, dress still on, makeup smudged at the corners of my eyes, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel fully before. Humiliation. Quiet, private, unbearable. It wrapped itself around me like a second skin. And worse, I had clapped along with it, smiled, pretended. But inside? Inside, I wasn't shrinking anymore. I was beginning to harden. This wasn't a fluke. It wasn't an offhand remark or a bad night. It was the truth. The way he saw me. The way others saw me because of him. And that clarity, that was the beginning of the end. Because once a woman sees clearly, once the fog lifts, she doesn't go back to sleep. She starts planning. Not revenge, not rage, but rebirth. 3 weeks after the banquet, I stopped waiting for Dean to come home. Not physically. He still came back every evening, dropping his keys in the bowl by the door, muttering about contractors or clients. But emotionally, I stopped waiting for him to look at me the way he used to. I stopped checking his face for approval, stopped telling him about my day, stopped hoping he might say something kind without being prompted. I started pulling back in ways that no one noticed. I left his dry cleaning for him to pick up himself. I stopped refilling his prescriptions. I stopped reminding him about birthdays and vet appointments and quarterly taxes, and still, nothing, not a word, not a question. It was as if my absence barely created a ripple. And in that quiet space, I realized something. I had already left the marriage emotionally. The only thing left was logistics. One afternoon, I opened my old laptop, the one Micah had once called ancient and suggested we recycle. I dusted it off, plugged it in, and waited as it hummed to life like an old memory waking up. I hadn't used it in years, but there it was. A folder labeled Ideas. Inside were files I didn't remember saving, sketches of packaging concepts, lists of product names, notes on sustainable materials. I had made these when the kids were young, when I was up nursing at 3 a.m. or waiting in the school pickup line, when I still believed I might one day start something of my own. I clicked through the files slowly, tears brimming, not from sadness, from recognition. This was me. This was mine. This was the part of Alara that had never really died, only gone dormant under years of being needed but not known. That same week, Micah, who had recently moved back in after a breakup, noticed I seemed distant. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked one night as we both stood in the kitchen, pretending not to snack on too many chocolate chips. I smiled. "I'm just thinking a lot lately." He nodded, unsure. He didn't push, but I saw it in his face. That quiet awareness kids have when they start seeing their parents as people, not just roles. Then came the moment I stopped hiding. Dean had forgotten our anniversary, completely. No card, no flowers, no mention, just a late arrival home and a barked complaint about traffic. I had made dinner anyway, out of habit, I guess. Roasted vegetables, grilled salmon, a chilled bottle of white wine. I'd even lit candles. Something in me had wanted to try one last time. Not for him, but to see if he would even notice. He didn't. He walked past the table, dropped his briefcase by the stairs, and turned on the TV. "Did you pick up my prescription?" he called out. I sat at the table alone, watching the candles flicker. I didn't cry, I didn't shout. I just stood, cleared the plates, blew out the flames, and went upstairs. The next morning, I opened a new bank account in my name only. I took the check Corinne had given me months ago, the one she said to use when you're ready, and deposited it. I started applying for an LLC under the name E.M. Quiet, initials for Alara Monroe, with a nod to the way I had survived for years, quietly. I didn't tell anyone. Not Dean, not even Micah. I wanted it to be mine, a seed I planted without an audience. A week later, Dean asked if I'd called the plumber about the leak in the guest bathroom. I said, "No, you'll need to handle that." He looked up, surprised. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said. And I was. He shrugged, muttered something about being overloaded, and left it at that. Everyone assumed I was simply checked out, that I had finally worn down into complacency, that I was a shell of the woman they once knew. But inside, I was wide awake. The truth was, I had walked away. Not in a blaze, not with slammed doors or suitcases in hand, but slowly, silently. I had removed myself from the role I had been forced into for decades. And in that space, where disappointment used to live, something else began to grow, resolve, and maybe even ambition. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to comfort me. Now it echoed. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the clock, every gust of wind outside felt amplified. The silence didn't soothe me anymore. It reminded me that I could scream in this house and no one would notice. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Dean had left early to play golf with a few colleagues. Micah was out with friends. I had the whole house to myself. A rare, golden window that I used to crave when the kids were young. Back then, time alone felt like oxygen. Now, it just felt empty. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe. A cold cup of coffee sat untouched beside me. The kitchen was half clean. Dishes drying on a towel, a smear of jelly on the counter from breakfast, crumbs under the chairs that I didn't bother sweeping. I hadn't brushed my hair. I hadn't opened the blinds. In front of me were old bills, a few unopened birthday cards from friends I hadn't replied to, and a notebook I used to keep my thoughts in. For the first time in months, I opened it and stared at the blank page. Nothing came out. The words, the energy, the spark, all gone. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad in the usual way. I felt hollow, like I'd stepped outside of my own body and was watching a stranger drift through her day. I walked to the laundry room and stared at the piles. One for Dean, one for Micah, a small one for me. I started folding automatically. T-shirts, socks, underwear. I paused when I picked up a sweater I hadn't worn in over a year. Pale blue with tiny pearl buttons. Dean once said it made me look washed out. I had never worn it again. I dropped it back in the basket. I wandered into the den and sat on the floor, pulling an old photo album from the bookshelf. The thick leather cover was worn, the pages soft from years of flipping. Baby pictures, birthday parties, vacations where I'd taken all the photos and appeared in none of them. I flipped to our 20th anniversary, a photo of Dean and me at the beach. I was smiling, holding a wine glass. Dean was mid-sentence, gesturing to someone off camera. I looked so hopeful, so trusting, like I believed this life we built was made of something permanent. I closed the album slowly. That evening, the power went out. A blown transformer in the neighborhood. I sat in the living room in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, lit a few candles, and listened to the storm outside. The wind rattling the windows, the trees groaning. It felt fitting, like the universe was matching my internal weather. I thought about calling someone. Corinne, Sienna, just to hear a voice. But what would I say? That I'd wasted decades? That I didn't know who I was anymore? That I was afraid I'd disappear before anyone realized I was gone? Instead, I lay down on the couch and stared at the flickering ceiling shadows. Rain hit the windows in erratic patterns. I pulled the blanket tighter and whispered, I don't know how to do this anymore. Not this marriage. Not this house. This life. I fell asleep in the dark with the storm still raging, my body curled like a question mark, the blanket pulled over my head. When I woke up the next morning, the power was back. The lights buzzed faintly overhead. The refrigerator hummed. The world had returned to normal, but I hadn't. I stood in the kitchen with bare feet on the cold tile floor, staring at my reflection in the microwave door. My eyes were tired. My skin was pale. I looked like someone I didn't recognize. And in that moment, that raw, unfiltered moment, I felt the full weight of it all. The years I had given, the parts of me I'd buried, the dreams I had labeled as silly and selfish, the things I had let die in the name of duty. This was rock bottom, not because I had failed, but because I had been forgotten. Mostly by others, but more painfully by myself. And yet, in that brutal silence, something stirred. A flicker, a breath. Not of hope, not yet, but of awareness. Because the moment a woman realizes how far she's fallen, how much she's lost, is the same moment she begins to wonder what rising might look like, and I was about to find out. It started with a box in the attic, not a dramatic discovery. No hidden letters, no secrets from Dean. Just a dusty, unlabeled box I hadn't opened in years. I'd gone up there to find a space heater. The autumn nights were getting colder. But I found something else entirely. The attic was quiet except for the creaks of old beams and the patter of squirrels on the roof. It smelled like cedar and cardboard. I shifted old holiday decorations and baby clothes, then spotted it. A medium-sized box sealed with cracking tape and one of my old post-it notes on top. Faded handwriting. Ilara, do not toss. I dragged it to the center and sat on the floor, cross-legged like I hadn't done in decades. Inside were fragments of the woman I used to be, marketing brochures I'd designed back when I was 22, crisp, clean layouts with hand-drawn logos and branding notes, a folder of sketches for a natural skincare line I'd once dreamed of starting, clippings from business magazines I used to read religiously, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of tissue paper, was a mock-up of my own business card. Ilara James. I hadn't yet taken Dean's last name. Creative Director. Aurora Concepts. My fingers trembled as I held it. I remembered exactly where I was when I made that card. In my first apartment, sitting on a borrowed office chair, imagining a future that looked nothing like the one I ended up living. I had plans, ambitions, not grand or flashy, but mine. I sat with that memory for a long time. It wasn't painful. It was grounding. Because the moment I held that card again, something clicked. A quiet, internal truth I had avoided for years. I wasn't just a wife. I wasn't just a mother. I had always been more. I had simply stopped believing it. I flipped through the folder and found notes I'd scribbled on branding psychology, pricing strategies, even distribution models. They were rough but smart. There was a line under one of the logos, built from quiet strength. I'd written it in block letters, underlined twice. A sudden wave of emotion swept through me. Not sadness, not regret, but recognition. That line wasn't just for a product, it was for me. I didn't cry. Not this time. I felt aware, awake, like I'd been in a coma and was slowly regaining consciousness. And then something even stranger happened. I started imagining what that business might look like today. What would I sell? Who would I reach? I remembered Corinne's tea line, the vendors she worked with, the community she built around her small but thriving brand. What if I started with something simple? A set of handmade home products, natural, sustainable, designed by women for women who had also been overlooked. I thought of the name, E.M. Quiet, E.M. for Ilara Monroe. Quiet for how I had lived, and how I now wanted to rise. For the first time in years, I felt a pull, not obligation, not guilt, but purpose. The idea of building something from the ashes of all I'd given up didn't scare me. It felt right. It felt like closure and beginning all at once. I carried the box downstairs and spread everything out on the dining table. Dean wasn't home. Micah was at the gym. It was just me and the artifacts of the girl I used to be. And suddenly, I didn't feel small anymore. I felt capable. I opened my laptop, the newer one Micah had bought me a year ago for my birthday, and started a new document. I typed one line. This is mine. Then I listed out every idea that came to mind. Product lines, taglines, domain name ideas. I watched the words appear like sparks on the screen. The page began to fill, and with every bullet point, my confidence grew. This wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't a coping mechanism. It was a blueprint. And it all began with a dusty box in the attic. Forgotten, yes, but not lost. Like me. That discovery didn't just remind me of who I used to be. It showed me who I could still become. It's strange how clarity doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes like warm sunlight slipping through the blinds, subtle, gentle, and unmistakably real. That week, everything started to look different. The house didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a space I could repurpose. The kitchen table wasn't just where I served meals. It became my planning station. The den, once a place where Dean drowned out the world with cable news, became my silent laboratory. The room where I sketched packaging ideas, compared Shopify plans, and watched YouTube tutorials about direct-to-consumer branding. I began to wake up with a sense of purpose. It started small. I rearranged my daily schedule, carving out early mornings for uninterrupted work. I stopped waiting until the house was clean, the dinner was made, and everyone else's needs were met before tending to myself. Instead, I treated my dream like a job, because it was. It had to be. I dug out an old composition notebook and labeled it Quiet, Phase 1. The title gave me chills. It was real now. Not just sketches or daydreams, not just a dusty memory I visited in the attic. This was movement. This was momentum. Corinne was the first person I told. She was pouring us tea at her kitchen island when I pulled out the notebook and laid it flat. I want to build something, I said, and I want it to matter. She didn't blink. She just smiled, set down her cup, and said, "It's about time." We spent 3 hours discussing suppliers, price points, and launch timelines. Corinne offered to introduce me to a local woman who sourced ethically made textiles, and another who specialized in e-commerce logistics. By the time I left her house, I had 5 business cards in my purse and a list of action steps that made my hands tremble with excitement. At home, I ordered a used Cricut machine and began designing labels. I practiced on old mason jars and cloth bags. I experimented with essential oil blends and fabric softeners. The kitchen, where Dean had once laughed about me managing the pantry, was now the heart of a small empire in the making, and I felt alive. Dean didn't notice the shift. He was too wrapped up in his own mounting business pressures to see that something in the house was changing. I was changing. He still asked what was for dinner, still came home late, still assumed the house would run like a quiet machine. I let him assume. I let the invisibility cloak stay on, for now. But inwardly, I was on fire. One morning, after dropping off a sample order to a boutique owner who had agreed to test my products, I stopped by the local coffee shop. As I waited for my order, a woman complimented my tote bag, one I'd designed and printed the night before. When I told her I had made it, her eyes lit up. "Do you sell them?" she asked. I hesitated, just for a second, then smiled. "Yes, I do." The words felt revolutionary. Yes, I do. I walked out of that coffee shop taller, not because of the compliment or the sale, but because I had spoken about myself in the present tense. I wasn't someone who used to be creative. I wasn't someone who might build something one day. I was doing it. That evening, while Dean watched a rerun of a football game, I sat at the kitchen table and finalized the logo design. Clean serif letters, a muted, strong color palette. At the center, a tree with deep roots and quiet branches. Resilient, feminine, alive. Quiet. Dean called out, "Can you grab me a beer?" I looked at the fridge, then at my open laptop, then back to the screen. "I'm working," I said, without raising my voice. He muttered something under his breath, but I didn't hear it. I didn't need to, because something had changed. Not the circumstances, not yet, but me. I wasn't asking permission. I wasn't waiting for validation. I wasn't hoping to be seen. I had seen myself. And now that I had, there was no going back. The fire was back, quiet, controlled, but fierce. And it was only just beginning to burn. By the time the first frost crept across the front lawn, I had opened a business account, filed the paperwork for Quiet LLC, and signed a 3-month lease on a tiny studio space across town. Nothing glamorous, just a refurbished garage with decent lighting, a wide work table, and enough shelves to hold supplies. But to me, it felt like the headquarters of a revolution. I didn't tell Dean, not because I was hiding, because I was building. And I had learned the hard way that not everything sacred has to be shared. I started my days earlier, waking up before the sun rose, when the house was still wrapped in silence. I'd make tea and sit in the soft glow of my desk lamp, planning inventory runs, responding to small orders, checking emails from local boutique owners. A few had agreed to stock limited batches of my products, handmade linen sprays, cotton sachets, naturally dyed towels with minimalist tags that read, "Strength and Quiet." The first time I saw one of my products on a store shelf, I stood still for a full minute. I didn't take a photo, I didn't even touch it. I just stared, not at the jar, but at the fact that I had done this. At home, I kept playing the same role, the agreeable wife, the dependable mother. I still cooked most nights. I still reminded Micah about his job interviews. I still let Dean vent about his slipping profit margins and idiot vendors. But something was different. I wasn't investing in his problems anymore. I was listening like a visitor in someone else's house. I had started separating his world from mine, emotionally, mentally, even physically. I moved my workspace from the dining room to the guest bedroom. I stopped asking about his meetings. I stopped waiting for him to ask about mine. He never did. The day I applied for a wholesale partnership with a nationwide home goods chain, Dean spent the afternoon shouting at one of his subcontractors on the phone. I signed the agreement in the kitchen while he paced past me 3 times. He didn't even glance at the paper, and I preferred it that way. Corinne helped me refine the brand messaging. Micah unknowingly helped me run a few test pages on social media when I told him I was helping a friend. I used that opportunity to study engagement patterns, improve ad copy, and figure out what made people click. Slowly, orders increased. By December, I had fulfilled over 300 units. Small, yes, but steady. Real. I created a separate email alias. I registered a P.O. box. I met with a female attorney Corinne recommended just to ask questions about intellectual property, liability protection, and what it meant to scale. The woman listened, nodded, and said, "You're doing everything right." And I was, because I was doing it silently. No one could sabotage what they didn't know about. Dean noticed something eventually. One evening, while I was folding labels and watching a webinar on vendor management, he looked up from his chair and said, "You've been kind of distracted lately." I looked at him, really looked, and realized something. He hadn't changed. He hadn't even noticed he was losing me. Not emotionally, not practically, not financially. He still thought I was orbiting him, that I was still quietly humming in the background of his story. I smiled and said, "Just thinking a lot these days." He nodded and went back to his TV show. That was it. And somehow, that moment felt like liberation. Because what he didn't know was that I had already rewritten the story. The future he assumed we were heading toward, retirement trips, charity galas, maybe grandkids, that wasn't my finish line anymore. My finish line was different now. It had spreadsheets, logos, a future. The silent setup was never about revenge. It was about redefinition. I was no longer reacting to a life I didn't choose. I was designing one. Brick by brick, order by order, decision by decision. And as I packaged products late at night, my hands steady and my heart clear, I whispered a sentence I'd once written in the attic notebook, now etched into the lining of my mind. You don't have to scream to be powerful. Sometimes silence builds empires. And mine was nearly ready. By the time spring arrived, Dean had started pacing more. I noticed it before he did. The way he'd rub his temples at the dinner table, mutter about cash flow problems, swipe through his phone like he was hoping for a miracle to appear in his inbox. There were more late-night phone calls, more half-finished sentences, and an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. His business was declining, subtly but steadily, and for the first time in years, I didn't offer to help. I used to be his quiet fixer, rebalancing the checkbook, smoothing over client tension, rewriting emails he didn't know how to word. But now, I simply listened and nodded, all while fulfilling orders of my own, approving mock-ups, and prepping a second product line for launch. He thought I was distracted. He was right, but not in the way he assumed. One Thursday morning, he stormed into the kitchen holding a printed flyer. "Have you heard of this company?" he asked, voice tight. "They've been stealing our clients, offering lower bids, same service. Our regular vendors are switching over." I glanced at the flyer. My heart stuttered. Just for a second, it was mine. EM Quiet Construction Supplies, a division I had quietly co-branded and launched with a female-led fulfillment partner who specialized in high-end materials. The branding was intentionally vague. The founder listed as E. Monroe. No photo, no interviews, no social media presence. On the surface, it looked like a sleek, efficient disruptor in a male-dominated industry. Dean had no idea. I feigned interest. Never heard of them. Sounds competitive. He grunted and tossed the paper aside. They won't last. I smiled into my coffee mug. Maybe not. But we both knew better. The power was shifting, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. At home, Dean became increasingly unsettled. He made jabs about my schedule. What are you doing with all this free time? Or, must be nice not to work and still be so busy. I didn't answer. I didn't defend myself. I just went about my day, in and out of the house with samples, packages, business meetings tucked into coffee dates. I no longer needed to argue, because silence had become my leverage. Micah noticed. One night, while helping me load boxes into my car, he looked at the logo printed on a shipping label and said, "E. M. Quiet. That's yours, isn't it?" I froze for half a second, then nodded. He let out a low whistle. "You've been building this all along?" I met his eyes. "Yes." He looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Respect. Not pity, not surprise, just quiet admiration. "I'm proud of you," he said. And for the first time in a long time, I believed I'd earned it. That week, I hired my first part-time assistant. Her name was Tasha, a single mother who needed flexible hours and believed in the mission. I gave her fair pay, autonomy, and the dignity I had gone without for too long. Every day I gained more ground, and Dean kept losing his. At one point, I overheard him on the phone with his brother. "Things just aren't like they used to be. I don't know what Alara does all day. She's just gone quiet." He wasn't wrong, but he didn't realize that silence wasn't absence. It was intention. I had stopped explaining myself, stopped trying to earn his interest, stopped performing domesticity like it was the only stage I was allowed to stand on. And in that shift, I discovered something deeper than anger: freedom. I no longer needed Dean to approve of me. I didn't need him to change. I had changed, and that was enough to alter the gravity in our home. He began to sense it, even if he didn't understand it. The tension in his shoulders, the way he hovered in doorways, as if trying to catch pieces of conversations I wasn't having with him. The hesitance in his voice when he asked where I was going. My answers were brief, always honest, never detailed. He hadn't earned the full picture anymore, and he didn't know, not yet, that the very future he was scrambling to preserve would soon belong to me. Not because I'd taken it from him, but because he'd thrown it away, and I had quietly picked up the pieces and turned them into something stronger. It happened in a way I never planned, but perhaps the universe did. Dean came home early one Friday afternoon, his footsteps unusually heavy. I was in the kitchen packaging a small order for a boutique in Portland. The sun poured through the windows, catching the gold foil of my product labels as I smoothed them across the jars. I was humming softly, hands steady, when I heard the front door slam. "Alara," he called, sharper than usual. I looked up, wiped my hands on a towel, and met him in the hallway. He was holding a manila envelope, his jaw tight, his eyes darker than I'd seen in a long time. "What's this?" he asked, holding it up. I recognized it immediately. A copy of the vendor proposal I'd submitted under E.M. Quiet to one of his former supplier clients. A copy I had accidentally left in the printer tray. My name, E. Monroe, in the corner, a seal at the bottom. I didn't flinch. "That's mine," I said. He stared. "Yours? This is your company?" "Yes." "You've been doing this behind my back?" I tilted my head, calm. "Behind your back? Or beside you? Quietly while you ignored me?" His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in a long while, Dean didn't know what to say. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Why didn't you tell me?" I took a breath, one I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. "Because when I used to tell you things, Dean, you laughed. You dismissed them. You made jokes in front of your friends. You called me just a housewife. So I stopped talking, and I started building." He looked stunned. "You've actually been competing with me?" I shook my head. "I've been replacing myself." He blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means I stopped asking for space in your world. and I built my own." He paced, rubbing the back of his neck like he always did when he was losing control. "You went behind my back, Alara. That's betrayal." "No," I said, steady as stone. "What you did for years, reducing me, ignoring me, underestimating me. That was betrayal. This is justice." He sat down at the edge of the couch slowly, as if the air had been sucked from the room. "I thought we were partners," he muttered. I nodded. "So did I, until I realized you weren't treating me like one." The silence between us stretched, thick and unfamiliar. It wasn't angry, it was something else. Something truer. For once there was no yelling, no plates thrown, no slammed doors, only clarity. "I'm not here to destroy you, Dean," I said gently. "I'm here because I finally remembered who I was, and I'm not going to forget again." He looked at me, really looked, and I saw the flicker of something in his eyes that had been missing for years. Not love, not even regret, recognition. Like he was finally seeing me again. Too late, but clearly. "I didn't know you were capable of this," he whispered. I smiled softly. "You didn't care to find out." He didn't respond, he didn't have to. Everything had already been said. I picked up my package, tucked the label neatly onto the box, and turned to leave. As I walked toward the front door, he asked, "Where are you going?" I paused and looked over my shoulder. "To the post office, to ship something I created." I didn't say it with bitterness. I said it with pride. That was the moment. The reveal. Not in fury, not in fire, but in quiet, absolute truth. Not a confrontation, a correction. He stayed seated, stunned, and I walked out the door with the kind of peace I used to pray for. Because I hadn't just built a business, I had built me, and I didn't need him to understand it. I just needed him to finally see it. A week after the confrontation, Dean applied for a new job. His business had all but crumbled. 2 major contracts pulled out after switching to more affordable, better-managed suppliers. He blamed the economy. He blamed disloyalty. He never once considered that his competition had come from right under his nose. I didn't rub it in. I didn't offer comfort either. Micah told me in passing. "Dad's interviewing with a mid-sized firm. He's nervous, but he won't say it." I nodded. "That makes sense." I didn't ask which company, but a strange feeling told me I already knew. And 2 days later, I was proven right. I sat at my desk in the studio when the email came through. The subject line: Candidate interview, Dean Monroe. The sender: Carla Ramirez, HR Director at Bridge and Rise Collective, one of the fastest-growing eco-conscious interior goods brands on the West Coast. My company had recently merged with them through a partnership deal I had personally negotiated. I clicked the email. There was Dean's resume, neatly formatted, along with a request for my thoughts as one of the company's partners before moving forward. His skills were solid. His references checked out. But one line in his application caught my attention. Strong leadership in residential development, passionate about uplifting women-led communities. I stared at the words, blinking in disbelief. Uplifting women-led communities? This man, who mocked me for wanting to return to work, who introduced me as the laundry queen, who publicly joked about me managing the pantry, now claimed to champion women-led causes? The irony was exquisite. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel vengeance. I felt something purer, alignment. The universe, as it turned out, was meticulous in its timing. Carla had attached a simple yes-no form. I could have let the company's standard process decide, but Bridge and Rise had a core value. Any founding partner could veto an upper management hire if there were ethical conflicts of interest. I thought about it for a long moment. I thought about my younger self, the one who'd written business ideas in the attic, the one who sat alone at dinner tables, the one who once cried in the laundry room because she felt so disposable. Then I opened a reply window and typed slowly, deliberately. Dean Monroe is not the right fit for our company culture. He does not align with our values of respect, equity, or collaborative leadership. I respectfully advise that we do not move forward with his application. No bitterness, no insults, just the truth. I clicked send. Later that evening, Dean came home with a tired smile. He tossed his keys in the bowl and said, "Had a promising interview today. Felt like a good fit." I looked up from my laptop, nodded once, and returned to work. He didn't know. He would receive a polite rejection email the next morning, thanking him for his time. He'd never know that I had sat on the other side of the screen, that his wife, the woman he once called just a housewife, now had the power to decide whether he'd get the job. He didn't need to know, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. I wasn't the same woman who folded his laundry and laughed off his insults. I had outgrown that version of myself like an old dress I'd never wear again. Dean's world had shrunk. Mine had expanded. The final justice wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was this. I had become everything he told me I couldn't be, without his permission, without his support, without his recognition. And when he knocked on a door hoping for a new beginning, I was the one who decided not to open it, not out of cruelty, but because I finally could. That's the difference between being underestimated and being invisible. One gives you space, the other gives you power, and I had used both, in silence, to build a door of my own, one he would never walk through. The following Sunday, Sienna came to visit. She hadn't been home in nearly 6 months, caught up in the whirlwind of her new job, a serious boyfriend, and city life. We spoke often on the phone, but it wasn't the same. I'd noticed her slipping into a familiar pattern, distracted, dismissive, sometimes impatient. She had picked up pieces of her father without realizing it, but when she walked through the front door that day, she paused, like she could feel it. The air was different. So was I. "Wow," she said, setting down her bag, eyes sweeping across the space. "It feels, I don't know, lighter in here." I smiled. Things have changed. We sat on the back porch with tea and slices of cornbread. The garden was blooming. Soft lavender, tall marigolds, the rosemary bush I'd planted the week Dean called me just a housewife. I found comfort in its smell now. Sharp, clean, resilient. Sienna sipped slowly, watching me with the curiosity of someone seeing a familiar face through new glass. "I've been following that brand, Eam Quiet," she said. "Everyone at my office is obsessed with it." I waited. She looked directly at me. "Is it yours?" I nodded. "Yes." She blinked, then let out a breath that was half a laugh. "You're kidding." "I'm not." There was a pause, not awkward, just full of everything unspoken between us. The years she'd called me old-fashioned, the times she'd interrupted me, changed subjects, treated my quiet like irrelevance. And then she said something that almost made me cry. "I had no idea. I'm sorry, Mom." I didn't need the apology, but I accepted it. Not because I craved her approval, but because I could finally hold it without needing it to fill me. "You were busy building your life," I said gently. "I was busy remembering mine." She reached across the table and touched my hand. "I'm proud of you." I looked at her and felt the balance shift. Not mother and child, not giver and taker, but two women meeting in the middle. "I'm proud of me too," I said. And I meant it. That night, after Sienna had gone and the house was still again, I walked into the guest room. It wasn't a guest room anymore. It was my studio now. The walls were lined with shelves. My logo hung above the desk in a simple frame. Spools of ribbon sat neatly in a row beside a row of labeled jars, folded towels, and fabric swatches. Every corner whispered, "Asterisk, you did this." I lit a candle, lavender and cedar, one of my own blends, and sat down at the desk. I opened the same notebook I had carried through every phase of this journey, the one that began in silence and disbelief. I flipped through the pages, notes, drawings, lists, thoughts I didn't think anyone would ever read, and on the last page I wrote, "I am not someone who needs to be seen to matter. I am someone who sees Asterisk herself. Asterisk. And that is more than enough." Downstairs, the dishwasher hummed. The wind pressed gently against the windows. In the distance, I could hear the low whine of a dog barking 3 houses down. Life went on. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to prove anything. I had taken every quiet moment of dismissal and turned it into a monument of purpose. And as I sat there, candle flickering beside me, I finally understood something I'd spent a lifetime chasing. I was never asterisk, just asterisk anything. I was always becoming. And now I had arrived.